from Dan earlier today about critical metals and the rise of minor metals in anything from critical infrastructure to small household appliance has really raised concerns amongst many national and regional questions about security of supply being asked, where we're going to source our critical raw materials from. Is this something national government this is something national governments are really concerned about? Can we source enough materials to serve our needs? Do we need to develop our own national inventories, for example? And it's also recognised we need to decarbonise. Now, a key part of this is reduced resources. How can we achieve this? Can we reduce the impact of mining through changing how we source minerals? What are the stocks available from prime extraction versus stocks for recycling, for example? We need to know these things. We need to know what the inputs, the primary inputs into tools used for environmental accounting, life cycle assessments, like material flow analysis. All these require resource data in some form. And more importantly, and perhaps the point of this whole talk, is what we really need is an understanding of what these terms mean, so the correct data are available and the correct questions can be asked of what this data can kind of deliver. So a little bit of history on resource and reserve data. Now, I'm sure many listening will be very familiar with this, but if you're not, a very, very brief introduction. So the first kind of moves to really officially define what was meant by the terms of resource and reserve was made by McKelvey, working for the USGS in the 1970s. And you can see kind of a very basic version up my screen. This was built over the years. It wasn't until like in the mid-1990s until formal internationally recognized definitions were adopted by the minerals industry. The driver for this being several really big scandals which massively undermined confidence in investors in the mining sector. This kind of culminated in the BRIC scandal, the story of which is, there's a simplified version of the Kelvin diagram there. And there's a nice picture of Matthew McConaughey there, starring in the film about BRICS, which is a very good film for those who are interested in more detail on this. Anyway, since then, many national codes have been developed which really tightly define what these terms mean. Many of these conform to internationally recognised standards, and these are administered by the Committee for Mineral Resources Internationally Reporting Standards, or CRISCO. Great. So as a result, there's very little confusion about what's meant by resources and reserves in the minerals industry using these definitions. However, there has been a great deal of confusion for those outside the minerals industry, amongst politicians and academics, as to what these data are, what they physically represent, and what you can really do with them. And that's kind of caused problems. So despite numerous excellent articles explaining why this isn't correct, I still see things about how humanity's on the brink of running out of some key commodity or other. And I think my colleague Andrew Blugger is going to talk about this issue a lot more in detail in a talk later on this week. Now, we as geologists know that if you put enough money in your exploration budget, you probably find more mineral. We know grades of new discoveries are decreasing globally. However, technologies are constantly improving for extraction. New deposit models are being developed and refined. And you can see from the panic of a rare earth a few years ago, this kind of really highlighted this, that if you actually look for more mineral, there's a lot of exploration was done, they found a huge amount more. The constraint in that instance wasn't lack of resources, wasn't lack of resources in the Earth's crust, it was something completely different, which is certainly a topic for another presentation. So what are the major issues? Now, a good example of kind of what some of these are is seen from a project I worked for on Horizon 2020 project called Minerals for You a few years ago. It was asked, amongst other things, to build an inventory of European resources and reserves for a very wide range of commodities. Many in the European Commission considered this a really simple data gathering exercise to answer some important policy questions they had. However, despite months of really painful data collection, no inventory could be forthcoming. And there's two reasons for this. The first being quite simple. Around 20 different definitions of resources and reserves are being used across Europe, including many different individual national definitions that we use for national reporting. And these all measure really different things. If you think about that simple Kelvin box from earlier, these definitions of what a resource constituted fitted a different part of that box. So you couldn't simply sum the data. And there's a second problem, which is that although much of the data wasn't Crisco compliant figures, which is great, we know exactly what they are, we can compare and contrast those. These data are being specifically designed for the purpose of ensuring investor confidence. They're not real measures of physical stocks, they're economic entities. They constantly change with changing socioeconomic situations locally. So they kind of tell you what's available in maybe 5 or 10 years, but they're not really designed for long-term planning or these kind of national resource management or calculation of national inventories, which is the kind of data that I'm talking about here, the kind of that's been asked from national governments, the kind that's needed for undertaking long-term environmental assessments and comparisons. They don't include things like the sort of sub-economic undiscovered resources, which kind of fit in that bottom right-hand corner of that simplified Kelvin box. This kind of information isn't covered by Crisco. Now, this isn't in no way a criticism of this kind of scheme. It wasn't designed to do this. We're asking something it wasn't designed to do for. So we have an issue there. It kind of doesn't quite work for the purposes we're using it for. So one option perhaps is to use the United Nations Framework Classification. So this is something that I've been doing a lot of work recently with, and this is a classification that's been designed by the UN for trying to quantify in a comparable way different types of resources. And by doing this, we can, there's a huge scope, a huge flexibility to fit in different types of resource data. I haven't got the time today to kind of explain it all in detail, but basically you've got 3 axes, which are environmental, socio-economic viability, technical feasibility, and degree of confidence. That degree of confidence used to be geological knowledge. It's just recently been changed. But sort of to explain that makes it a bit more understandable kind of what that means. So you can look at that in 2 dimensions. Oops, sorry, I've gone forward a few slides there. So you can look at that in 2 dimensions, which perhaps a little simpler. So you can kind of see the common stages of the life cycle of mineral projects and kind of where they equate to that kind of UNFC matrix. So you can see one of the main strengths of it is that it's possible that all those different definitions of the different areas of that Kelvin box, anything from what's in operating projects to theoretical models of what's maybe in the Earth's crust at kind of continental scales, can be fitted somewhere within UNFC. And this flexibility makes it very attractive to organisations such as geological surveys, who hold very large amounts of data, often historical data, various vintages, which is really important, valuable on a kind of national level. We can't define that in a kind of Crisco context. So, it's really useful to be able to define that in a consistent way using schemes and tools like UNFC. Something else the new version of UNFC also includes is a real clear linking to the SDGs in the environmental and socio-economic viability axes, and that's makes it very strong on kind of reporting on this level. So this kind of knowledge, using definitions that incorporate all these different possible types of resource data can really help us to identify data gaps as well, so we kind of know where this data might be missing. So it's important, so this is really important. So when, let's say, and this is a real example, the EU may say, well, how much copper do we have in Europe? We need to know how much copper we have in Europe. we can now demonstrate, if not actually necessarily provide data for, how there may be a certain amount available in current mines. We can quantify that. But how actually there might be a vast amount more, if required, of resource if the socio-economic conditions were different within the Earth's crust. And Dan set me up a bit here earlier with his comment about tellurium and byproducts. A lack of data does not represent a lack of resources. So, and this is a really important point. That example from tellurium earlier, if you did a study of how much tellurium resource you have on the planet, obviously there's only one mine that reports that. So, that number in its own would be meaningless. You need to take into account when you're using that number the way that the minerals, the complex way that the minerals industry works, various economic factors, and how this kind of integrates with how this data is kind of presented, which is a really complex thing to try and explain to a policymaker who just wants a simple number they can base something on, which is really hard to do. And this is why tools like UNFC become quite important here. I haven't really got time in detail to talk about many issues around things like the nightmare that is byproduct reporting. But if you're interested, I can send you some reports later if you get in touch with me. Going back to the more sustainability side of things, this kind of knowledge is also really important as an input in undertaking exercise such as life cycle analysis or materials flow assessments. Without understanding what stocks are available over different timescales, it's really hard to actually model what's going to happen down the line. So you need to understand what you're going to start off with before you can really understand what you're going to end up with. Also, a better understanding where resources are. We may be able to source minerals close to home with better environmental standards, less transport distances, integrate kind of mines with other heavy industry, much more strategic planning, things like that. So I'm just going to quickly sum up. So if we want to plan for least environmental damaging forms of extraction, we really need a good understanding of stocks. Classifications like the UNFC are a really good way of doing this, but of course, definitions, standards will only get us so far. What this really hinges on ultimately is work on exploration, work on development of minerals data that we already have by re-evaluating historic data in a modern context. This sort of research is really key to understand what we have and what we have in terms of these sort of critical metals and these tricky issues around byproducts and things like that. But of course, I would say that as a geologist. So that's it for my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Tom. As per usual, you can imagine that fantastic applause that is ringing out on the other side of those muted microphones. So thank you very much for that. I think your talk is actually very well timed, because we have been hearing over the course of the session yesterday and this morning some really good insight into some of those codes of reporting. So, for example, Teresa spoke about the South African code, so SAMREC, this morning. And I know that we've got a range of different people from, say, for example, the European code, so that's PERC. I should just point out as well, I know that there are lots of people online who will not have a clue what we mean by this Crisco and PERC and all of this gobbledygook. And what Rose and I will attempt to do, and everybody else, please feel free to weigh in here, is actually try and define what on earth we mean by these weird words that we're using here. With this, Tom, I've got a question here that's come in from Teresa and then built on by Richard. So if I may, one of the challenges with any framework that talks to feasibility and degrees of confidence is going to be subjective, depending on who is the person who's actually doing the assessment. And with that, feasibility for a small or a junior company is not going to be that as for the same for a multinational mining company. So taking this, to what extent does the UNFC address the range of assumptions that can go into assessments undertaken by those different companies?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say this as not a UNFC practitioner. I'm not heavily involved, but I am someone who's been sort of trying to develop training materials and things to help its use in recent projects. So you're right. I think it is subjective, and this is very difficult. And something I've been trying to do is provide examples from lots of different case studies. And there's another Horizon 2020 project which is also trying to do this. There's a GERA project trying to do this at the moment, trying to provide case studies to kind of show how we can classify things in UNFC, because UNFC it has been around for a while, but it's still quite new in terms of being developed, and there's still a lot of questions to be asked. However, I think saying that, I think any resource code or classification is also subjective. If you delve it, I think into the detail of Perk or JORC or anything like that, I think that when you get into the real nitty gritty of it, you always have to make subjective decisions based on geological. Well, I would say geological expertise, but in terms of the expertise of whatever aspect you're looking at, be that the kind of sustainability aspect, the geological aspect, or whatever. So and that's where it all comes. There's no easy fix. I think UNFC code is a very useful tool, but it still has to be used by experts in whatever field, the geology or the environmental side of things. So you still need that kind of expert person thing. And I think with regard to UNFC, that kind of, it's still the questions are being asked about kind of how the expert person role, kind of competent person really fits into that. But, I think that's the key there. It still has to be done by experts, and they have to make those subjective decisions. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you very much, Tom. And what you will see when you come out of your talk just now is you'll see a stream of questions beginning to flow in for you. So if you want to start addressing those.
Can I make one comment? Sorry,
yeah,
I've just seen some of those. And I wanted to stress as well in some of the comments, I mean, in no way suggesting UNFC or CRISCO are in any way in competition. They are two completely different ways of quantifying things that are used, I think, in very different settings. And I think that's a key point. They're in no way, competing.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much for that, Tom. And again, just to take a massive step back. So all of this stuff about CRISCO, UNFC, PERC, SAMRAC, SAMESC, etc., is all about how much of this is actually in the ground that we can get hold of. Okay, so that's what all of these weird words are talking about as a whole, because of course we want to understand that in order to understand what are those stocks. And I really like the way that you use the word stock there, Tom. Do we actually have access to then be able to utilize further down that value chain? So awesome, thank you very much. Everybody put your hands together in that virtual silence for the wonderful Tom. As we now